Our next speaker is Mr. Tom Rand. After a number of years as a successful software entrepreneur, Tom now focuses his efforts on carbon mitigation. He's active in clean tech venture capital, technology incubation and commercialization, and public advocacy. Tom is managing partner of ArcTerm Ventures, a senior advisor at the Mars Discovery District, and sits on the board of a number of clean energy company and organizations. Tom also developed Planet Traveler, a low-carbon hotel project in downtown Toronto. Tom's first book, Kicking the Fossil Fuel Habit, was published in early 2010, and his second, Waking the Frog, became a bestseller in 2014. It is his belief that we have yet to have a serious public conversation about the threat of climate change and the economic opportunities afforded by the global transformation to a low global economy. Tom holds a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering from the University of Waterloo, a Master of Science in Philosophy of Science at the University of London, and an MA and a PhD in Philosophy at the University of Toronto as an Action Canada Fellow. Pour tous les francophones, ça va être une bonne session, ça s'appelle Réveiller les grenouilles. For those of you in English who can understand that, this is a good presentation for us French people. It's called about waking the frog. So, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Tom Rand.
Thanks, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today. I take it it's a pretty climate-savvy crowd, so I'm going to skip over a lot of my fairly alarming. Sure, yeah, absolutely.
For those of you who are listening to us over the internet or anything, you will not be able to see Tom's slides, although here in the room we will have access to them.
But I don't refer to the slides specifically too often, so you shouldn't miss too much. So my day job is I build clean energy technology companies, right, which is the technology component of a solution to climate disruption. But I've been spending a lot of time over the last couple of years wondering why globally we seem so hamstrung on climate action. And we've all heard of the horrible story of the frog and the pot of water in the stove, right? You put a frog in a pot of water, you put the pot of water on the stove, and the water heats up slowly enough that the poor frog, by the time it realizes, its little nervous system lights up and it realizes it's in trouble, it's paralyzed, and it can't hop out of the pot. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. I haven't tried it, but as a metaphor, it's very effective. And I think it's not alarmist to ask the question, are we that frog? I think anybody who reads the business pages and understands how much capital continues to flow into long-term, high-carbon infrastructure, who has another eye on carbon counts and understands where business as usual is taking us, I think it's perfectly reasonable to make that comparison. But I make that comparison not to be alarmist, although I think it is an interesting metaphor. There's a lot at stake here, but because I'm interested in not the noise, right? I mean, we know there are the Koch brothers, and we have scientifically illiterate pundits like Margaret Wente commenting on climate disruption as if she had an opinion that mattered on the science itself. So we know that there's noise, right? I'm not interested in the noise. What I'm interested in are what lies beneath the surface. Just like that frog's physiology is underwritten by some genetic blueprint that locks that frog into place, I want to know what are the underlying reasons that lock us into place. What's happening beneath the surface? What are the rules of the game that predispose our economic system, our cognitive systems, our political systems into paralysis on this subject? Because presumably if we can get beneath the surface and understand why we're paralyzed, then we are more able to sort of leap into action. So that's why I use this metaphor. It's not just to sort of point out the danger, but to ask questions about systemic reasons for paralysis. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on climate. I think you know where we're headed. We all have our favorite anecdote. These anecdotes are beginning to add up very slowly into a very coherent picture. Don't think of it so much as temperature as energy. You know, we're putting the energy equivalent, we're trapping the energy equivalent extra due to greenhouse gases, the 400,000 Hiroshima bombs every day. That is how much energy we are trapping in the atmosphere, and surely the atmosphere is big, but so is that number. And that's why what's really at stake is not whether you can play shinny in the wintertime, it's about shifting our climatic structures significantly into a different state, into a different long-term state. Long-term weather, rain patterns are changing, and there's a lot of energy in which our infrastructure is going to be succumbed. It's going to be under a lot of stress. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I'm probably talking to the in crowd on climate risk, but climate risk is substantial. I don't think I can overstate it. But why are we paralyzed? Well, really, I see it as a mix of four different areas, right? I can sort of characterize them as subject matters, economics and psychology and politics and so on. But at the end of the day, it is simply difficult to believe for any human being that this problem is as bad as it is. It is hard to think about. And when we do think about it and we do figure out what's happening, we feel like our hands are tied. There's an enormous amount of inertia in our system, physical inertia, financial inertia, and so we feel like our hands are tied, even if we wake up and smell the coffee. And then, of course, we're subject to market forces, right? So even though we'd make an effort, we feel like the market is such a force it's going to burn every piece of coal in the ground, right? Which is another reason why we're paralyzed. And then the last sort of spot for those who are recalcitrant on action to hide is just simply say it costs too much, right? So it's hard to think about. When we do, when we realize what's going on, we feel like our hands are tied. We're tied because we've got jobs to go to, we have a living to make, we have profits, and we are subsumed under market forces that seem very difficult to fight. And even if we did, it seems to cost a lot, right? And I think those are the four categories about which I'd like to speak today. First of all, when I talk about denial, I am not merely talking about those who say climate disruption is not true, right? That's what I call active denial, right? There will always be people who need to be dragged kicking and screaming into the 21st century. That's life. What I think is more pernicious is what I call passive denial, something of which we are all, myself included, guilty of to some extent. Passive denial is where you accept that it's happening. You accept the truth, right? You say, I believe NASA is right on this thing, or the IPCC, they know what they're talking about. But we act every day as if it weren't true. Because if we acted as if it were true, there would be riots in the street. This is the end game of industrial civilization. This is whether or not our civic structures survive, so our kids have roughly the same kind of world to live in that we live in. So all of us act, we have to act as if it weren't true because it's simply too frightening. So when I say denial siren song, I'm speaking more of that kind of passive denial, right? Active denial is a force too, but passive denial I think is a little more pernicious. So it's siren song. Sirens were these, in ancient mythology, beautiful women who sang beautiful songs that were so alluring, right, that sailors couldn't help but be attracted to that part of the water and they'd smash their boats and die horrible death. So denial is a kind of siren song to which we are all attracted. Why? Why is that the case? Well, and why is this important? Well, one of the things that those who are active on climate have done for a long time is simply say, well, if only the public knew, right? If only the truth were out there, then we would act, right? Just get Fox News out of the way, get all those recalcitrant actors out of the way, just get the truth out there, and we'll act on that, right? And that seemed to be the strategy for the past 25 years or so. That's simply not enough. The truth is not, we are not rational creatures. That's the problem that we have. So simply putting the information out there allows us all to be in passive denial to some extent. I'm going to talk about why that is. So we need to understand something about how we think. There are lots of words for the division between conscious and unconscious thought. Conscious, unconscious, symbolic, non-symbolic, slow, fast. Many writers about cognitive science use different descriptors. They're all talking about roughly the same thing. From the day we're born to the day we die, we are forming connections between ideas, predominantly at the beginning, less so at the end. That's the way our brains work. Once you have a certain set of connections in place, other kinds of connections may or may not follow. In any case, so as a baby, mum, lovely. Tiger, roar. Zoo, fun. Money, powerful. So we form these connections between sounds, words, ideas. Literally, we're forming connections. That's what a neural network does. That's why we're not rational, but that's also why we have common sense and the computer doesn't have common sense. The sum total of all those connections that automatically and very quickly associates one idea with another happens automatically, and it's how we make sense of the world. Right? It gives us a worldview. It's the way in which we're able to disambiguate meaning in open-endedly complex environments like standing here in front of you. I can tell what's relevant just by looking, because I'm a human being with a body and a set of interests and a worldview. The most difficult thing to teach to a computer is common sense, right? That's what we have that computers don't have. It allows us to make very fast judgments, recognize relevant patterns, disambiguate meaning, understand natural language, and so on. And as we get older and older, this worldview becomes more and more complex, right? These are a set of beliefs we have about the world. They are unconscious, they are physically instantiated, and they precondition our reaction to new information. That's just how the brain works. There's nothing controversial in that. But worldviews have content, right? And the fact that we have a worldview, we don't have to sit around saying it all the time, right? So, for example, in the Western world, that human ingenuity knows no bounds, right? That's a deeply held belief in much of the Western world, right? That human ingenuity knows no bounds. Now, we don't have to actually explicitly run around saying this to ourselves to hold that belief. That belief can be implicit, right? So beliefs are often culturally relative, right? Different cultures can have different kinds of worldviews. But the point is, we process new information, new beliefs, through an existing set of understandings, through an existing set of associations that we have as human beings. Human ingenuity knows no bounds. The future is better than the past. There's a very deeply held belief in the Western tradition, particularly in the Western economic tradition, right? The future is better than the past. That's what the whole notion of progress is based on. And I'm not saying these beliefs are false, right? We have good reason to hold these beliefs. A lifetime of experience has got us here, right? So these beliefs are not false, right? But they are implicit and deeply held. Someone somewhere will take care of this, right? As a kid, your parents take care of something. We've solved big problems in the past. Someone solved the problem. Someone will probably solve this problem. Hubris. Ever since Sir Francis Bacon talked about we have opposable thumbs and a rational mind, nature is ours to control, right? If you look around the world today, it pretty much is. We've fished all the oceans. We've farmed all the land, right? We've mastered geography. I can get in a plane. I can fly to China. It does look like nature is ours to control, right? So there's a kind of a hubris around what we believe. Steady hand to the tiller. Small c conservative thinking, right? That you mess with your social and economic fabric radically at your peril. Giant social experiments have failed miserably. Steady hand at the tiller is very good advice and has gotten us through some very tough times, right? So these are good beliefs to have. There are reasons we hold these beliefs. The problem, though, is that all of these beliefs are incompatible with climate disruption. If 4, 5, 6 degrees is coming, all of these seem false. So the problem, that's why people get so upset about climate. That's why it's such an emotional conversation. People get angry when you talk about climate. If they're a climate denier in some way, they get angry at you. There's a reason for that. You're threatening their worldview. Even if it's all happening unconsciously, you are threatening their worldview. And two incompatible beliefs in the brain cause it's called cognitive dissonance. It causes distress. And that's why people get angry when you talk about climate. You are threatening their worldview. And so you will do all kinds of things to avoid that new belief. Right? So lest we think this is academic, there are measurable cognitive biases. I really recommend a book by Dan Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow, which goes over a lot of this stuff, not particularly as it relates to climate, but as a general overview of cognitive science. So what I'm saying is not controversial in cog-sci circles, as they say. This is bog standard stuff. This is how our brains work. It's how all our brains work, myself included. So cognitive bias, this is sort of a way in which your brain will precondition new information such that it is more likely to sit well with an existing worldview. First thing you're going to do is avoid effort, right? Every physical system seeks a low energy state. The brain is no different. When someone is asked, what do you think about climate disruption? The first thing the unconscious brain will do in all of us, right? I'm not making a judgment about people. I'm making an empirical claim about how we all think, right? I'm not making a judgment. I'm making an empirical claim about all of us and what it is to be a human. When someone is asked, what do you think about climate disruption? The first thing the unconscious brain will do is a bait and switch, right? Because climate disruption is scary and slightly complicated. And what the brain will actually answer is, how does climate change make me feel? That's the question that your brain will answer immediately, without any effort. And it makes us feel uncomfortable. And emotions play a very large role in how we form beliefs. And so our default position is going to be, I don't believe it, because it makes me feel uncomfortable. Every human being on this planet will have a default position that climate change can't possibly be as bad as they say it is. right? It's a very uncomfortable belief to hold. It makes us uncomfortable. And the unconscious brain will do this without us even being aware of it. So we will all approach this issue starting from can't be that bad. And then we seek confirmation bias, right? All of us seek evidence to confirm beliefs we already have. Confirmation bias is hard to avoid in the hard sciences, never mind in real life, the soft, messy stuff of everyday life. So we start out by not believing, by thinking it can't be that bad, and then we go online. We find all kinds of confirmation for the fact it's not possibly as bad as those scientists say, right? So we seek evidence to confirm a belief that we already have. And then someone presents an argument to you to say, actually, it is as bad. Here's the argument. Well, if you don't like the outcome of an argument, if you don't like the conclusion, you won't believe the argument. We are not rational robots. We are not Spock. We are human beings. If we don't like the conclusion of an argument, we will not believe the argument, right? So that's why it's very difficult to convince somebody with evidence that climate disruption is as bad as it is. And peer group bias, the people who surround us every day are much more important in how we form beliefs than experts. It is our religious leaders, our family members, our friends, and our colleagues who shape our beliefs, not NASA, the IPCC, or the Goddard Space Institute, right? It's our friends and family and our religious leaders. So you can see how for 25 years, 25 years ago, Margaret Thatcher stood in front of the UN General Assembly and called climate change the single greatest threat facing humankind, right? 1989. Military hawk, good friend of Ronald Reagan, free market ideologue, scientifically literate. So 25 years, you can see how groupthink has formed around climate. And the evidence has become overwhelming, right? And at some point, the dam breaks, right? At some point, the dam breaks. Your brain can't keep this stuff out forever. You twist yourself into ever more irrational circles trying to keep this belief at bay, right? But over 25 years, the evidence mounts and it mounts and it mounts, and eventually the dam breaks. So all I'm really saying here is there are an enormous number of biases, rules of the game, rules of the brain that make it difficult to believe. And we need to take that seriously. And anybody who's a marketer knows I'm really just talking about good marketing. That are froggy to wake up. We need a different strategy, right? I don't think you can avoid talking about climate disruption. I think you have to talk about why we're doing this. But you also need to talk about it in a way that enables the problem and the solution space to coincide with our worldview, right? So we talk about an open-ended future of energy security underwritten by next-generation clean technologies, underwritten by an economic stimulus, job-creating packages we rebuild for a beautiful, bountiful future of clean energy, and yada, 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 yada. That's the kind of story that speaks to the best in ourselves. It speaks to our sense of hubris. It speaks to our ingenuity. The future is better than the past in that story. The story happens to be true. It's not easy to do, to build this future, but that future happens to be possible, and it coincides with our view of ourselves. And you can see how our cognitive biases would now work with us, right? Your default position is going to be, I like it. This economic prosperity, job creating, energy security, technology underwritten, great. I like the sound of it. So your default position is now more open, right? And of course, if more people talk about it and we have more success stories, confirmation is possible, and so on and so forth. So my point is only an issue of marketing, really. That the mistake we've made for a long time, those of us on the climate file, again, has been to think that if we only put the truth out there, the public would come with us. It's not enough to put the truth out there. We have to put the truth out there in a way that allows people's minds to embrace this thing, because we can be in denial about this for a very, very long time, right? By the time the evidence is incontrovertible, it's too late. The horse has left the barn, we're done, right? So this is nothing that a good marketer doesn't know, but I think we need to take seriously how we think when we first begin to approach this problem, right? So, well, I've got some more detail here, but what our froggy really needs to do to wake up are stories of clean energy abundance, right? And successful stories of clean energy abundance, like Morgan Solar building solar farms in the oil-rich Mideast at 5 cents a kilowatt hour, Canadian success story, right? Woodland Biofuels, who can make a gasoline replacement from wood chips cheaper than the gasoline it replaces, be the lowest cost fuel provider in North America. Right? So there are the beginnings of these kinds of stories, but it's important that we emphasize them because that's the piece that people will grab onto. The solution is a good one, and we have to have that in the same conversation as 6 degrees, we have no choice but to do this. Right? So it's a balancing act, and everyone picks their own way how they balance it, but we need to take seriously how we think because information is not enough. Humans are not robots. Humans have common sense and worldviews that are incompatible with this horrible future that may be awaiting us. So we need to figure out a way to let that information in. So that's the first thing our frog needs, is it needs new stories of clean energy abundance. Then it becomes possible to grapple with this issue. Then of course you go to work, you're like, well, I gotta make a living, I got kids to worry about, my hands are tied. Every time a CEO company goes into work and they see the light, they can't turn that coal company into a wind company. They'd be fired. So people's hands are tied, right? People have a job to do. There are vested interests. There's money in play. There's fiduciary obligations. And every time moral purpose meets fiduciary obligation, guess who wins? Fiduciary obligation, right? So people's hands really are tied. Waiting for our corporate leadership to simply wake up and get on with it will not work because their hands are tied, right? And we need to ask why. The momentum in the system is enormous. Right? We spend $6 trillion a year on fossil fuels. Vaclav Smil has pointed out correctly, I think, that even if you come up with a better, faster, cheaper solution on the energy side, historically, it takes 50 to 100 years to replace one energy source with another kind, even if the new energy source is cheaper, better, faster. That's the nature of infrastructure. That's just the way it is. Now, for Mr. Smil, for Vaclav, his conclusion is we are historically determined. There is nothing we can do. We're not mathematically determined, as some will have it. We're historically determined to take 50 to 100 years in this transition. And of course, we don't have 50 to 100 years. And if you ask Mr. Smil what that means, he will say, well, we don't all have to make it to the end of the century. He's a very dark fellow. But his arguments are really good. He's a very smart guy. I don't think he's wrong about the historical nature of these energy transitions. He's right. The lesson, though, is something has to be different in the context this time around, or we will be historically determined, right? All else being equal, he's right. So something has to change about the rules under which this transformation happens, because just letting the market do it by itself, even if it's better, faster, cheaper, is not enough. That's the nature of infrastructure. So hold that thought in your mind for just a moment. Change the context. This is a story about fiduciary obligation. This is a story about the CEO who goes in and wants to change his company into a new green energy company, and the board of directors fires them. Has anybody seen the movie I, Robot? Will Smith, based on a story by Isaac Asimov? Well, the robot has a prime directive in the story. The prime directive is something like, don't hurt humans. Right? Everything else that robot does is subservient to the prime directive. Corporations have a prime directive. It's very simple, make money. And it's often in the corporate document how they're going to make money. And that's it. Right? The notion that we're going to have an enlightened set of CEOs come in and change the way they do business, it'll only go so far as that change is more profitable for them. So the lesson here is we have to line up the prime directive of our energy companies and our investment funds, everything else. Let's align that prime directive up with solving the problem. Because if they're not aligned, the prime directive will always win. Right? Triple bottom line, corporate social responsibility, I think those are great things, but they're only ever going to go so far. They're only ever endorsed or taken on board to the extent that they increase the long-term profitability of that company. That's it. And we have to be a little bit honest about that, right? It's very simple. Corporations have a single objective. So keep that in mind. We need to change the rules to align the prime directive with solving the problem. Because if we don't, fiduciary obligation will stop enlightened management from trying to make that change. That's just the hard way that it is in the corporate boardroom. Attitude matters. Tom Steyer, I don't know if anybody here knows Tom, billionaire hedge fund manager from the States, very smart guy, very successful man, turned climate hawk, right? He's quit his job and he's now very active in the United States trying to put climate on the agenda. He Hank Paulson and Michael Bloomberg got together. They have a group called Risky Business, which analyzes the economic downside of climate to explain to their fellow business people why they have to get on this. Tom tells a story. He says, I was talking to another friend of mine, and Tom hangs out with billionaires, so it's a fellow billionaire, and he's saying, why aren't you alarmed? Why haven't I convinced you that this is a problem you need to deal with? You're a smart guy. And his friend said, I live in the 19th floor penthouse in downtown Manhattan, and my fridge is always full of food. Why should I worry? And I think that's actually a very honest and enlightening answer, right? No baloney. The problem isn't mine. I'm wealthy. Now, Sandy might have woken some of those folks up in Manhattan, but at the end of the day, if waiting for the Richard Bransons of the world and all these enlightened billionaires to sort of come to the rescue, I don't think so. Because I honestly don't feel like the elite feels it's their risk to bear. And at the end of the day, as the subprime mortgage showed, if it's not your risk to bear, you will offload that risk. You won't act rationally as if that risk were yours. Right? So attitude matters, and the risk has to be felt by everybody. In other words, we need to change the rules of the game. So we change the rules of the game, or we're historically determined to take too long to do this. We change the rules of the game so the prime directive lines up with solving this problem, or corporations are hamstrung. And we change the rules of the game so the elite have no choice but to play along and feel as if the risk were theirs. Right? So we have to change the rules. We have to change the rules by which we play our little economic games. Now, some of you can guess where this is going to go, but let me give a little more context about how it is that we change that rule. There is, in North America anyway, a deep, deep commitment to a particular view of the market, and that view is you leave it alone. And you leave it alone to find equilibrium. Equilibrium is a magic place where supply meets demand, perfect substitutability of goods, utility is maximized for everybody, and so on. This is the invisible hand of Adam Smith. There are some very good truths about that, right? There are some good, that's a good conceptual framework. But it has become idealized in the sense that it's thought of to be a real thing, right? And so anybody who wants to interfere in the market, you have a very big burden of proof to explain why you should interfere in the market, because you're playing with equilibrium, right? Leave the system alone to find equilibrium. The problem with that whole, there's 200 years of academic work behind all this stuff, from Adam Smith right up to the neocons in the Chicago school. The very notion of equilibrium was introduced back in the 18th century because that was the only way they could solve the math at that time. Economics had physics envy, and they were building models because they wanted to be able to predict just like the physical sciences can predict. And in order to solve their model, they had to assume there's one point of equilibrium. So it's an artifact of the model based on out-of-date math. Nothing we study today of any interest operates at equilibrium. Equilibrium is a stasis, a kind of death. It's a test tube where nothing happens. Everything we study, from weather patterns to cells to neurons to social networks, everything that has a pattern that has of interest operates far from equilibrium. That's why it's something of interest, right? And there's a new kind of math by which we study all of these complex phenomena. Dynamic systems theory is one name for it. It's just a modern set of mathematical tools that are much more useful at trying to understand interesting behavior. Dynamic systems theory, complexity theory. And in economics, it's called evolutionary economics. It's nothing but a more modern set of mathematical tools to try to describe what is the most complex this called the global market economy, right? Because it includes all of us. It includes all of our brains, right? It is the most complex phenomenon on the planet, which is the global market. The challenge is this. With this new description of the economy, there are some things that emerge. One is that the market is endlessly creative, right? The very rules under which transactions occur change because we invent new ways of doing business, right? The law of diminishing returns gets complemented by the law of increasing returns because of Facebook. One more user is worth more than the last. It's not like an apple. Right? So the system at its very heart is creative. And it is therefore totally unpredictable. It is highly complex, highly creative, and therefore unpredictable. It's also path dependent. What happened before opens up new possibilities, but also limits new possibilities. It's path dependent. Time matters in a dynamic, evolving system. The fact that king coal already exists and dominates power production in many countries changes the grid, which changes how new entrants can come in. It has vested interest. It has capital flows. There's all kinds of reasons why king coal coming first changes the opportunities for other technologies, right? So it's path dependent, it's unpredictable, it's highly creative. That's a better description of the modern economy, right? And if you take that view seriously, well, a couple things emerge. One, since you can't predict it, you can't impose a solution. So I'm going to come to why a price on carbon is so important. A price on carbon on this view changes every transaction. Whether I'm buying a chocolate bar, or it's an investment banker investing in new technology, or someone building a power plant. Every transaction, of which there are billions and billions every day, is affected. So if you change the rule at the bottom in one of these complex systems, you can set it in a new direction. You can't pick an outcome. Just like on this picture of water flowing down a hill, I can't tell you what pattern that water will take. I can't tell you which molecule gets there first. But I can tell you the water will end up downhill, right? Price on carbon is like gravity in this picture. It will suck the economy towards a low-carbon state. We don't know how it'll get there. We don't know when it'll get there. We don't know who the winners are going to be. We don't know who the losers are going to be. But we've given the market a direction. And the last point I'll make is this. A price on carbon is not a left or right thing, right? The left has to suck it up and acknowledge that the market is the most creative and powerful social force that we have. The market is the winner here. Only the market can figure this thing out, right? You're giving it a constraint to solve for. It will evolve to solve for that constraint in ways that we can't imagine. The left has to acknowledge the market's power. The right has to acknowledge the market must be tamed, or it'll burn every piece of coal in the ground, right? So it's not a left or right thing. It's simply the most effective tool we have given a modern view of what the economy is. Give the economy a constraint to solve for, it will solve for that constraint. And that's what a price on carbon does. And that's why a price on carbon is uniquely interesting as a policy piece, right? Because only a price on carbon simultaneously harnesses the market and unlocks its creative potential, right? There's a real tension there, right? You're locking it, but you're opening it. That's what a price on carbon does. That's what a modern view of the economy tells us about a price on carbon. That's why it's such a powerful tool. So that's what our little froggy needs. He needs us to price carbon pollution. Last, and I'm going to sort of finish here, there are many who argue that it will cost too much. The standard models by which people do a cost-benefit analysis of policy action on climate are called the Dynamic Integrated Model on Climate and the Economy, or the Regionally Integrated blah, 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 called DICE or RICE. They're out of Yale by a very smart guy called Nordhaus. Nordhaus is an honest academic and admits the limitations of his model, right? This is not a criticism of Nordhaus. This is a criticism of those who use Nordhaus's model without understanding what its limits are. Right? The problem with these models, both many problems, and I'll point out very quickly, the science is dumbed down, so much so as to be near useless. Right? Climate science is a highly complex, non-linear feedback system with all kinds of models that intersect. And in order to stuff that in the spreadsheet, there's two linear equations, and that's it. Right? That treats the climate as if it were an oven. Give me a carbon number, and I'll tell you what the temperature is going to be. And it's linear, and he admits it only works up to about a degree or so. But the science is dumbed down. It had to be fit into this model. Now, there are ways to improve this as well. I have some suggestions for approval. The uncertainty cascades through this system, right? If you take something that's a little bit uncertain, multiply it by something that's a little bit uncertain, multiply it by something that's a little bit uncertain, the uncertainty magnifies. And by the time you come to the end, it's unknowable, right? That's what these models have to do. They're trying to take all kinds of causal steps, from releasing carbon to causing temperature change to the feedbacks to economic implications to regional economic implications, and there's uncertainties every step of the way. So there may be some good guiding principles that come out of this model, but you certainly can't have a precise estimate of the damage to the fisheries in the year 2080 if there's X parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. That's not what these models are capable of doing. The damage function is completely arbitrary, right? And again, Nordhaus admits this. You know, what's the damage from 1.2 degrees as a percentage of GDP? Well, it's a linear equation. 1 + 1 over alpha to the something, and he admits it works to maybe 1.2 degrees, and it's a total guess. It's a total guess, because we've never done this before. There is no empirical data that we can look at. The discount rate, by itself, it's like you go to a basketball game in the local hoop, and someone brings an NBA player to that game. Doesn't matter who else shows up, you know which team is going to win. The discount rate is that ringer, is that NBA star. If you have a discount rate that's 4, 5, 6, 7%, nothing that happens in the year 2100 matters. Nothing. You can make an assumption that the entire global fisheries will die on the year 2100, gone forever, and you discount at 4% to today. What should you spend on saving those fisheries, which is about a $100 billion a year fishery? And it's some trivial number. It's in the single digits of billions that you should spend between now and the end of the century. The point being that the damage from climate happens in the future, the costs happen to today, and nothing that happens 50 or 60 or 70 years from now matters if you use the discount rate. Now here's the problem with the discount rate. Not just that it brings the game. There are a number of arguments as to why the discount rate should be 0. Economists will argue it's an empirical choice. You read it off the market, right? That it's actually, it's a piece of data that you read off the market. There are a number of arguments as to why that is false. I will give you the most powerful one only. There are others. It's a logical error. The discount rate, if you're building a hospital or a bridge, you use the discount rate to decide if you should do it today or tomorrow, or decide what projects you should do. The discount rate is held constant. It represents the rest of the world. It is an external variable to the model you're considering. It is independent of the bridge or the hospital. In climate policy, the discount rate is internal to the model because the discount rate gets affected by climate. The discount rate can turn negative if the climate gets bad enough, right? It's an internal variable, right? So it's a logical error to suppose you can read it from the market and treat it as an external variable. There are other arguments against it. I won't get into them. Anyway, the point is, so these models can be improved. I'm sure Chris has lots of suggestions on how we might improve them. And so, of course, we should do that work. We should treat uncertainty with respect, because that's where the monsters lie. We can talk about the discount rate. We can increase sensitivity on the damage function, yada, 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 yada. I think we're using the wrong language, actually. There is a great story that was told to me by a philosopher of science at the London School of Economics by the name of Nancy Cartwright. So Nancy has a great example. She says, I'm standing on the top of a building in downtown London on a windy day, and I have a piece of paper in my hand, it's about this big, and I release it. Tell me where the paper will land. Those committed to quantified analysis will start with gravity and wind shear and three-dimensional landscapes of the city and so on. And they will have nothing of any use to tell you about where that piece of paper is going to land. It's impossible. It's a chaotic system. Can't be predicted. If you knew that piece of paper was a 20-pound note, you can say it'll end up in someone's pocket. So behind that kind of flippant example, though, is something important. And that is that sometimes everyday language, common sense psychology, they call it in the cog-sci world, everyday language captures truth conditions better than a quantified language ever can. Right? Sometimes everyday language is more accurate. It's more truthful. It captures truth conditions better than. There's a number of different ways of saying it, but sometimes everyday language is much more useful than a spreadsheet. And that's the case, I think, when it comes to climate. I'm not saying throw the models out, but I am saying treat them with a great deal of caution because they're not accurate. We don't have no idea what economic damage is going to come. And to do a cost-benefit analysis is a mug's game, just like predicting that piece of paper is a mug's game. And when we switch to a different kind of language, like we say something like, what's at stake? A lot. How bad is it? Really bad. Can we feed ourselves at the end of the century? I don't know. Probably not. Right? those truth conditions, I think that those questions and answers captures the truth conditions of climate disruption far better than an economic model. And it puts us into a kind of discussion that the public understands. The public can understand that kind of language, right? And we talk about things like insurance, right? We insure our homes. Why wouldn't we insure the planet? So we talk about the costs of action, which at most is 1 or 2% of GDP. I mean, even the critics of action have never presumed it's going to be more than 1% or 2% of GDP. So 1% or 2% of GDP to insure the planet against catastrophe. Well, that sounds sensible, right? That sounds a lot more sensible than doing a discounted cash flow reduction of the entire global fishery and trying to figure out, is it worth pricing carbon today or not? What's at stake? Everything. Will we be able to feed ourselves at the end of the century? Probably not. What will it cost to solve this problem? It'll cost us about a coffee and a few donuts a day. I have this I have an analysis in my book of what it costs. It's not much. If you work it out per person, per day, it's nothing. It's nothing. And so it's about a coffee and a donut a week is what it would cost us. If you assume the developing world can't afford a coffee and a donut a day, well, then we'll do a little more in our share. So we'll have like 4 donuts and a coffee a week. That's what it'll cost to solve this problem. It's nothing. It's really nothing when you talk about it in those kinds of terms, right? What's at stake? Everything. Should we insure the planet? Yes. How do we insure it? Put a price on carbon. Right? That's the kind of language I think the public can understand, and I think that language makes a lot of sense. That's what our frog needs to wake up, right? You talk about it in positive ways, change the rules of the game by putting a price on carbon and talking about that price as if it was insurance, because we haven't got another place to go. Remember in Apollo 13, I think it was 13, these guys were, where is it? There it is. One of the oxygen tanks blew up, right? And the world watched transfixed as NASA, the ground crew, and the astronauts, like with, duct tape and spit, tried to fix the ship and get home safely, right? And they did. They got home safely, right? Well, we don't have another place to go. This is our Apollo moment. We are on Apollo 13. The oxygen tank has blown up, right? That's all I have to say. Thanks very much for listening. Thank you. Good.
We'll have to ask this question and answer during the
during the panel. Yeah.
fitness round here.
Oh, excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate that. Thank you. Very kind.
We're going to take a couple of seconds to just reset the stage here, so don't go anywhere. We'll be with you in about 2 minutes.